Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom. I'm the creator of rulingplanets.com and Christopher Renstrom Astrology. And I want to welcome you to this week's episode where I want to talk about the new moon in Cancer taking place on July 5th. But what's peculiar about this particular new moon in Cancer is that it is sandwiched between two full moons. The first full moon was in the zodiac sign of Capricorn, and it occurred on June 21st. And the second full moon is also in the zodiac sign of Capricorn, and it will be taking place at 29 degrees Capricorn on July 21st. So, when I was thinking about this new moon in Cancer, Cancer, as we all know, is the zodiac sign of the mother, hearth, home, nurturing, closeness, the past, roots, and tradition. Sandwiched between these two full moons in Capricorn, Capricorn is ruled by Saturn, so it's of a more cold or wintry nature. Saturn is a planet associated with tests, trials, and tribulations, sometimes even sacrifice. So when I was thinking of this new moon in Cancer, connected to mothering, and also the idea of hardships, tests, and trials, well, there was only one story that came to mind, and it happens to be one of my most favorite movies, and that film is Stella Dallas, and that is the story that I would like to share with you today. Stella Dallas begins in 1919, Millhampton, Massachusetts. We see Barbara Stanwyck, who stars in the picture, reading a book of Indian love poems. Lord only knows where she got such a book. But anyway, she's reading a book of Indian love poems, and she's propped on the front gate of her house. And everyone from the mill is coming home, and they all walk past her house. That's because her family works at the mill. Her father works at the mill. Her brother works at the mill. The entire town works at this mill, and they all walk past the house. And so she's there with the book open of Indian lyric love poetry, reading, and she's waiting for a certain Stephen Dallas to walk past because she knows who walks past her house every single day. And Stephen does, and he keeps on walking right past her. Well, not to be defeated, Stella begins scheming about how she can get Stephen's attention. And she decides that one day she's going to go and deliver lunch from a fancy delicatessen to her brother, knowing full well that her brother will be out with his friends, his other co-workers, but she'll show up sort of at Stephen's office and present him with the lunch instead. And of course, that's exactly what she does, and Stephen falls for it. And it's a delightful scene because Stephen's like, wow, I was really hungry for lunch. And he's like, well, since my brother's not here, why don't you have it, Mr. Dallas? And this is wonderful because we can see the Cancerian themes right away. Aside from the fact that Cancer rules over mills and streams, Cancer also rules over food. Barbara Stanwyck, who happens to be a Cancer and the lead in this movie, as Stella Dallas, knows that the quickest way to a man's heart is through his stomach. And so what that wins for her is an invitation to go out to the movies. Now, there's a little bit of a backstory here with Stephen Dallas. Stephen Dallas isn't from Millhampton, Massachusetts. Stephen Dallas is actually from Chicago, Illinois. And Stephen comes from a very well-to-do family, an extremely influential family in Chicago. But what had happened is that his father had mismanaged the business, and that the family business experienced complete financial collapse. As a result, his father committed suicide. Stephen, who had been engaged to a young woman named Helen, has a complete mental collapse as a result, and he leaves. He leaves his family. He leaves his fiancée, Helen. And as far as Stephen's concerned, he's going to go to maybe Timbuktu or Indonesia or the farthest country that he can possibly get to. Well, Stephen doesn't really get that far. He gets as far as Millhampton, Massachusetts, where he takes on the role of a manager at the mill, and he's going to create a new life. The reason I stopped to sort of underscore Stephen's background is that it's very Saturnian. You can perhaps recognize the Saturn themes, the Capricorn themes immediately. Capricorns either have an absent or controlling father. In this case, it's an absent father who takes his own life because of financial ruin. And so Stephen has to separate from his family. Stephen leaves his family, which is kind of pattern throughout this film because of the shame, because of the scandal, and ends up in this, like, nobody knows where it is, Millhampton, Massachusetts town, where he happens to meet Stella. Now, it's at this point that when he meets Stella, Stella really doesn't know about his background. She doesn't know that he was a high society type or exactly how much money the family had had or anything along those lines. All she knows is that he's a successful man in the town and he doesn't work at the mill, he works for the mill. Okay. He's in an executive position. And that, as far as Stella's concerned, is a step up in the world, a step up that she's desperate to take. Hence, this book of Indian lyric poetry that she has no idea what it is. And you can tell right away she's not even really reading. But what's kind of nice about that Indian book of poetry is that Stella has a theatrical performing quality to her, okay? She knows how to sort of make herself look a certain way. And this means a lot to her. She knows how to present, how to become the image of what someone might desire. And she knows that that's a strength, and she's going to go ahead and play to it. And she does. So one night, Stephen and Stella are walking home from the movies, and the town has already begun to gossip about how Stephen and Stella are becoming an item. And she says to Stephen, "You know, I can't believe you like seeing me when you can be out with all the swells." And Stephen responds, "But I want to be with you. I like being with you, Stella." And Stella says, "I want to be like all the people you've been around. Educated, you know, and speaking nice." And Stephen responds, "No, no, don't be like anyone else. I like you just the way you are." And Stella says, "Oh, but I wanted to be different ever since I met you. And if I was around you long enough, I could be. Why, I could learn to talk like you and act like you. And pretty soon well, you've done a lot for me in these past couple of weeks." And Stephen says, "You've done a lot for me too, Stella. I was very lonely the day you walked in, and that's when they kiss." Now, what's fascinating about that exchange and what puts me in mind of the moon and also the new moon is that the moon we all know is a reflector of the sun's light. And so Stella begins with this whole idea of, like, she's fishing. She's asking, "Why do you want to hang out with me and not all the other swells?" Meaning, better looking, more established, financially better off people in town. And he says, "Well, I like you." And she says, "Well, I want to be like you. I want to talk like you. I want to think like you." And I feel like, if I could do that, that would be a good thing. I've always wanted to be different since we've met. So what we have here is Stella as the moon reflecting or looking to reflect the light of the sun. It's a new moon, so the sun is the more dominant of the planets here. And even though Stephen responds with, "Well, I like you just the way you are," that's not really altogether true. And so Stephen and Stella marry, and they have a child. Her name is Laurel, but they call her Lolly. The first cracks in the marriage between these two people begin the day that Stella comes back from the hospital with her infant, with the baby Lolly. She has been holed up in the hospital for weeks, and it was driving her crazy, and she hated it. And Stephen, is very happy that she's home, and she sees that there's all this mail, and he's like, "Oh yeah, everyone wrote you and with good wishes and things like this." And she's like, "Well, why didn't you bring these to me in the hospital? I was so lonely. I could have used all of this." And he's like, "Well, they're here now." And so she quickly goes through them, and she sees an invitation to the River Club. And the River Club is evidently a very haughty-taughty, exclusive club in Millhampton, Massachusetts. And she wants to go that night. She wants to go dancing that night. She can't wait, to get out and about. And Stephen's like, "Let's kind of rethink this. You just had a baby, and, I think you're needed here at home." Well, she whines, and she pulls on him, and she says, "I really, really want to go out dancing." And a couple of nights later, they do indeed go out dancing. And you can see what Stephen fell in love with when you see Barbara Stanwyck out dancing. Okay, Barbara Stanwyck was a Follies girl, and she's got this incredible figure. And, as Stella Dallas, she's out dancing and she's getting the attention of all the men, and she's spending very little, if any, time with Stephen at the table. That's because Stephen's sitting at the table with the mill owner and his wife and their friends, and they're kind of like an old, stodgy group. Well, Stella's out dancing, and she's out dancing with Edmund, who is the featured hoofer of the evening and the new person in town that everyone's talking about. And he's quite a dancer, and he's quite full of bonhomie, and he's full of great joy and laughter. And Stella's having a great time with him. And Stephen doesn't like it. Stephen doesn't like it one bit. And he intervenes and he tries to get Stella to come off the dance floor to sit with the table. And she's like, "No, no, I want to be dancing." And then he's like, "We're leaving right now." And she's like, "No, no, I don't want to leave." And so basically, Stephen, in front of everyone, is dragging Stella off the dance floor and taking her home. And so when they get home, Stella enters and she's like, "Well, you can start the lecture now that we're home. What have I done this time? Go ahead, begin." And Stephen says, "Stella, I asked you not to wear those earrings and that cheap imitation necklace. You took them off. You agreed. And after we got to the club, you came out of the dressing room and you were wearing them. Now, Stephen, I'm perfectly willing to let you tell me how to act. But please, don't give me pointers on how to dress. Allow me to at least know more about one thing than you do. Well, after all, I've been known to have stacks of style. You should have listened to Edmund, and he's been around too. He's traveled farther. All right then, Stephen, farther. Gosh, I don't care. I have to think twice every time I open my mouth. Stella, remember that you're my wife now, and can't look at another man. Stella, won't you try to understand? The fake jewelry, it's not important. None of these things matter in and of themselves. But what's to become of us? Stella, why did you marry me?" Stella responds, "Because I was crazy about you, silly. And I still am. Only, well, you just never seemed to." "Once, a long time ago, Stella, you said you were crazy to learn about everything to become someone, didn't you?" "Yes, Stephen. Please, listen to me, Stella. I'm only telling you this because I love you. Stella, the firm wants to send me to New York City to head the sales department there. I want to go, and I want to take you with me. But I want you to make an effort. I want you to try to be, well, what you wanted to be. Give up a few things for me and try to adapt yourself. Adapt myself. Give up a few things. Well, what do you think I've been doing for the past few months? And I'm getting a little sick of it too. How would it be for you to do a little adapting for a change? I don't see you giving up anything. You go on to New York, Stephen. I'm staying here." So what's happening here is that Stella is no longer the new moon. She's no longer dominated by the light of the sun. She's no longer dominated by Stephen. And she's becoming a light of her own. She's growing into her own light. But in some regards, she's not kept the original pact. She told Stephen, "I want to act in the way that you want me to act. I want to talk in the way that you want me to talk." And Stephen did this. And as he's done this, she's found her voice. She's found her backbone. She's found that she can't stand him correcting him when she says further and he corrects her with farther. And so the idea of moving to New York with him and the baby and being policed by him constantly is a huge nightmare. And so she tells him to go, and she's going to raise Laurel there in Millhampton, Massachusetts. Now, as she begins to raise Laurel, she's still a bit of a flippity gibbet, Stella. It's a youthful moon. She's drawn to bright, shiny objects. And when people hear her name and that she's Mrs. Stephen Dallas, they're like ooh and ah, and she likes that. There's a youth, there's an immaturity here. But what she also responds to is Laurel as a baby, and she begins to bond with Laurel on a very deep level. It's not what she had originally envisioned. She actually looked down on many of the women in Millhampton who would marry and have children right away, and she found that to be a very confining thing to do. But she enjoys Laurel's company, and she actually says she's rather mad about Laurel, and so she's very, very bonded to Laurel. But the difficulties that we see going on in the story of Stella Dallas is that Stella keeps making bad decisions or decisions that bear results at a bad time. In the next instance in the film, Stella is feeding Laurel, and she's just like a little baby, and she's in a high chair, and Edmund shows up, okay? And Edmund, as I said, is a bon vivant, and he's shown up with friends. And one friend starts playing the piano, and Ed asks if there's any liquor in the house. And she says, well, I've got some bourbon. And so they have bourbon. And Ed's like, do you want some? And Stella's like, no, 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 I don't drink. I have sarsaparilla. And Ed's like, oh, whatever. And he makes a joke that he makes oftentimes, which is like, why are you still married to that deadbeat who's never around? And you could have me and we could be a great whatever. And she's like, oh, Ed, you're so much fun. I love you as a friend. I have such great laughs with you all the time, but I'm not looking for anything to change. Actually, Ed, the most important person in my life is Laurel. She's the one that, you know what, Ed, I just can't get enough of her. I just have to be around her all the time. And Ed's friends start dancing, and then they're playing the piano, and Ed's like, well, let me pick up Laurel here. And she's like, sure. And he goes and he reaches for Laurel, and he picks her up out of the high chair. And Laurel begins crying at the top of her lungs. Laurel can't stand Edmund. She just starts screaming at the top of her lungs uncontrollably. And the maid comes in and says, there's a visitor, Mrs. Dallas. And she's like, oh, let him in or whatever. And she's like, Ed. And she's more focused on the crying baby, obviously. And of course, the visitor is Stephen, who shows up. And immediately the party dies, okay? It's like the guy stops playing piano, the women, go sort of like hide their glasses of bourbon, and Ed's there with a crying baby. And so they all make their exit really, really quick. And Stephen, ever the gentleman, is very cool and very aloof. And after they've left, he turns to Stella and he says, Stella, I can't have our child living this way. And Stella's like, oh, what's wrong this time? And Stephen says, it's not this time. It's every time I come. And Stella's like, what do you mean? Because there were a couple of drinks? What's wrong with that? Coming in here with that icebergy way of yours. And Stephen says, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude. But she's my child too. And I won't have this. I haven't wanted to take Laurel away from you, but take her away from me? What are you talking about? Here, Lolly, come to me. How dare you say such a thing? Give her to me. And Stella goes and she grabs Lolly out of Stephen's arms. And Stephen's like, Stella, please. And Stella's like, get out of here. Get out of here. Get out of here, I say. And so Stephen leaves. Okay. And then Stella's there. And the baby's crying. Lolly's crying. She's so upset. And she's like, and Stella's calming her. She's like, shh, shh. She's like, now, darling, you're here with mommy, and no one in the world will ever take you away. Nobody. Nobody. And so we fast forward to Laurel's 13th birthday. During this intervening time, Stephen has made himself pretty scarce. You never really see Stephen much after that. I mean, he's good with sending the checks and things like that. But Stella is really pretty much raising Laurel on her own. I mean, Laurel will see her father a couple of times a year and they'll go on vacation together, but Stella is raising Laurel. Now, Laurel is going to a boarding school, and Laurel also is having dance lessons and tennis lessons and elocution lessons and things like that. And Stella wasn't given much money by Stephen to live on. And Stella herself has been making sacrifices and maybe taking odd jobs as a dressmaker, because she's a fantastic dressmaker, in order to keep money coming into the house. But also, she makes Laurel's dresses. She copies them from department store windows and fashion magazines, and she's really quite good at it. And they often can pass as the real McCoy. And so, this whole idea of passing is something that Stella is very involved in, presenting Laurel as if she comes from very well to do, even though their financial circumstances are strained. And Mr. Dallas, Stephen Dallas, is hardly around and hardly ever to be seen. Well, it's during this period of time, years go by where Stephen and Stella are living apart. Laurel's growing older, and one day, Stephen happens to be popping into a department store to pick up a present for Laurel for her 13th birthday. What Stephen always gets her are books, and Laurel delights in the books that her father gives her, and she's an avid reader. Stephen is here looking for books to give Laurel for her 13th birthday, and he looks across the room, and there is a very well-dressed woman attended by her 3 sons. Stephen smiles, and he goes back, and he gets the books, and he heads on over the cash register. The woman turns around, and it happens to be Helen, his fiancée that he ran out on years ago. But there's no hard feelings because Helen had married, and she's now known as Mrs. Morrison, and these are her 3 kids. They are John, Lee, and Cornelius. And she introduces them, and Lee says, "Well, don't call him Cornelius. He likes to be called Corn. Cornelius is too fancy a name." And they all laugh. And Helen says, "Well, Cornelius is the man of the household now." And Stephen says, "How so?" And she's like, "Well, ever since his father passed, Cornelius is the man of the household, and he's been taking care of all of us." And Cornelius is all of maybe 14. And he's like, "Oh, Mom." And what happens is that the youngest son is treating them all to lunch at the cafeteria, and they invite Stephen to join them. And Stephen does, and he leans to the young son and he says, "And if you happen to be shy a couple of bucks, don't worry, I'll front you the amount." And they laugh and have a wonderful time. Well, what this does is that this reintroduces Helen into Stephen's life. Helen, the society lady from Chicago, Illinois, who now happens to be living in New York. And there's a little bit more to it as well. Yes, Helen is indeed widowed. Her husband, Mr. Morrison, did die. Mr. Morrison was significantly older than Helen, and Mr. Morrison has left Helen with a large amount of money. And so Helen is very well to do, but Helen doesn't really know how to manage all of these properties that have been left to her. And well, you can just sort of imagine what the conversation between her and Stephen is going to turn into. Meanwhile, Laurel has returned home from boarding school, and she has a surprise for her mother. Her mother happens to be working on a dress. It's Laurel's party dress for her 13th birthday. And she hears Laurel coming up the stairs, and she quickly takes the dress on the dummy and stuffs it in a closet to hide it because she wants the dress to be a surprise. So Laurel enters, and she's happy to see her mother, and Stella and Laurel embrace, and she's like, "Oh, it's so wonderful that you're home from school. And I'm so happy to see you. And just in time for your birthday, you're really excited about your party. We sent out all the invitations." And Laurel's like, "I'm so excited about my party. I can't wait to see my girlfriends. This is going to be so much fun. But mother, I have another surprise." And Stella's like, "A surprise?" And she's like, "I've brought my teacher home with me, Miss Philibrown." And Stella's like, "Oh, Laurel, I look a mess." And Stella really does. Her hair is unruly, and she's been working on a dress all morning and things like that. And cushions are thrown around. And she's like, "Let me go and introduce you to her. Let me bring her in." And so Stella very quickly, like rearranges some of the cushions and stuff, but not too well. And she's not really presentable at all. And Miss Philibrown enters. And of course, Miss Philibrown has a hat, a coat. She's primly dressed. She's an older woman. This is not the way that you want to be presenting your home to a teacher of your daughters at a boarding school. And so Laurel says, Mother, this is Miss Philibrown, my teacher from school that I've been telling you about. And Miss Philibrown says, Mrs. Dallas. And she's like, pleased to meet you, pleased to meet you. And Miss Philibrown says to Laurel, Laurel, could you give your mother and I a moment quickly? Go and fetch me a glass of water. I just want a quick moment with her. And so Laurel obliges and she goes to the kitchen to fetch them some water. And Miss Philibrown sits down with Stella and she says, Mrs. Dallas, I spend the weekends in Boston, and I wonder if you might not let me borrow Laurel for this one. And Stella's like, well, I guess I'm not really ready. I mean, she's just gotten home and things like that. And Miss Philibrown says, oh, it would be so marvelous. And Stella says, well, that sounds like a great idea. She could spend time with you. She could see some different shows and things, not just movies. And Miss Philibrown is, well, what I had in mind was museums and galleries. She seemed so interested. And Stella says, oh, yeah, she's crazy about that sort of stuff. She gets it from her father. And Miss Philibrown says, her father? You see, I've only heard about you. And Stella says, well, of course, she doesn't see as much of her father. Mr. Dallas's business keeps him in New York. Laurel re-enters with the water and corrects her mother, and she says, but I spend vacations with father camping up in Maine. It's delightful. And so Miss Phillip turns to Laurel and says, Laurel, your mother has just given permission for you to spend a weekend with me in Boston. And Laurel's like, when? And Miss Philibrown says, very soon. And so Miss Phillip leaves, and they're all kinds of excited. And Laurel asks really quickly, Mother, could I ask Miss Philibrown to the party? And Stella's like, of course, absolutely. And so while Stella's going and picking up some things, Laurel goes to the closet and opens it, and she sees the dress. She sees the dress that Stella has secreted there. And she's like, oh, Mother. And Stella's like calling out, what? And she's like, this dress, it's so beautiful. And Stella flies into a rage, and she rushes towards Laurel, and she's like, there you go again, poking your nose into all sorts of things. This dress was supposed to be a surprise for you. And Laurel's like, oh, Mother, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to have spoiled the surprise. And Stella, oh, don't worry about it. You know what? Now that you're here, let's go ahead and fit this dress on you so that you'll be ready for the party. And she's like, great. So Laurel unbuttons her school dress and gets out of it, and she hands it to her mother. And Stella hands her the dress that she wants to fit on. And she's about to put the dress up and over her head when Ed Munn enters from out of nowhere and says, it's like the Follies dressing room in here. And Laurel's embarrassed. She's scandalized, and she screams and she cries out. And she says, oh, Mother, you shouldn't see me like this. Because she's in her underwear. She's in her underthings. And Stella's like, oh, for heaven's sakes, Laurel. Ed's known you since you were knee-high, and he's seen you with hardly anything on. And Ed's like, and even less than that. What have you got to hide from your Uncle Ed, huh? You've got nothing to hide. And so he starts to chase her around the dummy. And it becomes a very frantic scene with Laurel holding the dress in front of her, and Ed poking at her and laughing and and all these sorts of stuff. And Stella gets furious, and she's like, Ed, stop. And she's like, Lolly, don't be a little fool. And Ed continues laughing and sits in a chair, and Laurel's completely embarrassed and leaves. And Stella turns to Ed and says, oh, Ed, I wish you'd stop teasing her like that. You know she don't like it. And Ed says, I know, but I get a kick out of a young one being so finicky. And what's fascinating about this scene is that you really see the meeting of the two different worlds coming together through the element of surprise. It begins with Laurel surprising her mother with having brought her teacher, Miss Philibrown, home to meet her. And her mother is not made up. She's not cleaned up. She's not ready to meet this teacher of hers. And so Laurel has sprung a surprise on her mom. And then we have Laurel trying on the dress, and Ed surprises them. And Laurel has to sort of break up this fight that's going on. And it's kind of fascinating. The film is made in 1937, and Ed's way is not overtly lecherous, but it's completely inappropriate. And what Ed's trying to do is say, hey, I couldn't walk in or whatever. I'm a member of the family, and And, she's all full of herself and, let's have a good laugh at Laurel's expense. And Stella comes between the two of them and she scolds both of them like she would a child, but she never really registers how inappropriate it is for Ed to have walked in on Laurel, who's dressing, and how upset Laurel is about it. And this plants the seeds of what's going to take place in the future. So Stella turns to Ed and asks if his car is around, and Ed's like, "Oh no, it's in the shop." He's like, "Why?" And she's like, "Well, I wanted to get things for Laurel's party, decorations and stuff." And he's like, "Well, let's take the train." And so they take the train. Now, when Stella goes out, as I referred to earlier, she has this sort of fashion forward sensibility that really isn't acceptable to other people. In other words, Stella overdresses. She puts on fancy hats, she puts on fake jewelry, fake fur, and she kind of looks rather garish. So, this is kind of the moon in its first quarter phase, where the moon has actually moved into the zodiac sign of Libra. And evidently, Stella Dallas was born with a retrograde Venus in her chart or something because she appears garish. People look at her and they're kind of like really astonished. Now, Stella's convinced that she's being all kinds of fashionable and very, very trendy, and she gets to show off who she is. She's got bracelets that jingle and jangle and make noises. But everyone else is really kind of like, oh my God, who would go out of their house dressed like that? So this period is the sort of first quarter moon in Libra. Stella thinks she's fab, chic looking, and she's showing it off to everyone. And so she and Ed Munn are on the train and they're having an hilarious time. The two of them, when they get together, they laugh, they joke, and that's what she loves about him. And they're carrying on and things like this. Well, one of the people on the train happens to be Miss Philibrown, and she's traveling back to Boston, and she sees Stella all decked out, looking garish, with this man who's clearly not Mr. Dallas, and the two of them are carrying on like overgrown children. And she's shocked and she's scandalized. And so what happens when the 13th birthday party shows up, and Lolly is in her dress, Laurel is in her party dress, and she looks beautiful. And the table is set in such a way, and the maid has cooked everyone's favorites, and there's like little place cards. She's waiting for all of her friends to show up from school. She's so delighted. Well, what happens is that the doorbell rings and they're all kinds of excited about who's going to be there, and they're fixing their hair and things like this. And the maid departs downstairs, and then she comes back up and they're looking to see who's going to show up. And the maid has a telegram and she hands it to Laurel, and Laurel opens it, and in it, Miss Philibrown has said that she can't make it for the party. And so Laurel feels bad, but she's not discouraged or anything like that. Then the phone rings, and one of the kids that she was expecting also can't make it. And the phone rings again and again. And as the afternoon goes on and they try to make appearances, it's clear that nobody's showing up for the party. And that what Miss Philibrown had seen on the train, she shared with all the mothers of the girls. And it's a wonderful moment. I mean, it's a heartbreaking moment, actually, because Lolly's putting a brave face on it. And the cook's like, well, should I redo some of the meal or whatever? Some of the things aren't as fresh as they could be. And Laurel, who's only 13, says, Mother, I don't think anyone's coming to this party today. And Stella just looks downcast. And she's like, let's go on in to dinner and we'll celebrate my birthday together. And it's this really remarkable moment because in this exchange, Laurel is the adult. She's the one who knows that there's not going to be a birthday party. And she doesn't want her mother to be hurt. And she doesn't want her mother to be upset. And so she's like, let's go in and celebrate my birthday. And Stella is beginning to figure out that they've been dissed, you know? And so she feels really bad about what's happened, but she hasn't really put two and two together. So this is where you're seeing the the home that Laurel has been raised in coming into conflict with the outside world, and the mother, Stella Dallas, not really quite recognizing what's going on. She knows that her child has been hurt and she's very angry, but at this point, she takes her cues from Laurel and accepts what's taken place and feels very, very bad for Laurel. But she hasn't really made the connection that this has something to do with society versus family, that's going on here. And that is about to become even more emphasized as the story continues. A couple of years pass, and suddenly Stephen wants to introduce Laurel to Mrs. Morrison. Now, you remember Mrs. Morrison. She was his ex-fiancée that he met again in the department store with her 3 sons, the one who has left all of that money and that property to manage. Suddenly, Stephen wants to introduce Laurel to her. There are things that he wants to experience with Laurel outside of camping. He's got a proper place for Laurel to come and visit him. He also has an agenda, which is to start selling Laurel on Mrs. Morrison. Now, when Mrs. Morrison, Helen, and Laurel meet, it's really love at first sight. Helen has a very strong attraction to Laurel. She sees a very refined girl. Now, in the book, this isn't really brought up in the movie, but in the book, Mrs. Morrison had had a daughter who had died in childbirth. And so she's always felt that yearning to have a daughter. And when she sees Laurel, who would have been about the age of her own daughter, she can't help but feel this incredible attraction to her, this incredible bond to her. And Laurel, at the same time, sees someone who is very natural. She knows who she is. She doesn't put on extra makeup or clothing. She dresses simply, and she's classy. And the country estate is pretty nice looking too. It's not like one of those apartments that she's been getting raised in and that her mother has been moving from apartment to apartment over the years. Laurel sees a very fine lady and someone who's very welcoming and who asks right away about her mother. There's no competition at all. Mrs. Morrison helps Laurel to unpack her things in her own bedroom, and she admires the dresses that are really quite beautiful. And Laurel's like, my mother makes these dresses. And she's like, your mother is a wonderful seamstress. I mean, these are extraordinary. Look at these. These are absolutely beautiful. And so Mrs. Morrison makes Laurel feel at home right away. And the boys, of course, are all agog with Laurel. And, they take her out to see what she's made of, like they get the dog to jump on her and Laurel's fine with the dog and they play tennis and Laurel beats them all and Laurel's better at cards than they are. And, they're like, gee, mom, Laurel's swell. So all the brothers immediately adopt Laurel as a member of their family. And you can see where Stephen is going with this. He wants to be with Helen. He wants to set up the family of his dreams. They're well-to-do. They know the difference between farther and further. They're very well educated. And so Stephen is basically planting the seeds for this transference of Laurel away from Stella and to the household of Mrs. Morrison. But Mrs. Morrison doesn't have an agenda here. She doesn't want to get rid of Stella. She's just happy to see Laurel. And Laurel is welcome to visit them. And Mrs. Morrison is actually quite comfortable with the entire arrangement. So, of course, when Laurel gets home from vacationing at Mrs. Morrison's Long Island estate, she's all kinds of excited about Mrs. Morrison, and she can't do anything but tell Stella all about how wonderful Mrs. Morrison is. And of course, she says things without thinking, like, oh, she never wears makeup. She doesn't need it. Mother, she just wears like beige and blue and maybe in linen or an off-white. She doesn't, feel like she has to add all of these other ornaments and things like that. And of course, these are all the things that, a mother of a young girl like Laura does not want to hear, that is rather insulting. And so, but Stella realizes her daughter's really excited about all of this, that her daughter's having a lot of fun, and she's not going to stand in the way of it. But like any person in Stella's situation, she is curious about Mrs. Morrison. And so she starts to ask questions of Laurel, like, well, how old is she? And Laurel's like, I don't know. She's young looking. And she's like, well, what kind of young looking? And she's like, is she 40? Is she 25? And Laurel's like, oh, I think she's 26. And she's like, 26, and Laura's like, oh, I'm sure she's 26, maybe 27. Oh, mother, she's so elegant. She's so young looking. She always looks fresh in the morning, all these sorts of things. And Stella's like, so how does your father know Mrs. Morrison? And she's like, well, her first name is Helen, which Stella immediately recognizes as the name of the fiance that Stephen had years ago. And she's got 3 sons. And she's like, oh, so she's married. She's like, not anymore. It's very sad. Her husband died. And Stella's like, he did. And he left Mrs. Morrison with all this property, a number of hotels and homes and estates and things like this. And they're very, very difficult to manage, mother. A woman of Mrs. Morrison's standing in the world has all this, that she has to run these properties. And so father, bless him, has been helping out. He's been helping Mrs. Morrison to run these properties. And Stella's like, oh, how convenient that she's widowed. How convenient that Stephen can help her run these properties. That must be a rather cozy arrangement. Oh, no, mother, they're the best of friends. You can tell. Do you want to see a picture of her? And she's like, in a moment, in a moment. I'm putting on my cold cream. So Stella has now like moved to her makeup counter and she's putting on cold cream and she has her hair all done up and she's kind of putting on the cold cream furiously, with great intent. And so Laurel passes Stella the picture of Mrs. Morrison and she's like, oh, and she reaches for the picture and she takes a look at it and she's like, oh, she looks nice. She looks dressed rather plain as far as I'm concerned, but Stephen's always been into that sort of look. And anyway, here's the picture. And she passes the picture back to Laura. And Laurel, of course, is like shocked. She's like, mother, no. And it's like, what is it? What is it? And Laurel's like, you've gotten cold cream on Mrs. Morrison's picture. How could you do such a thing? She's like, I'm sorry, Lolly. I didn't mean that. I was, and she's like, oh, mother, cold cream. So there's a disaster. Both of them get over it. Laurel's used to it with her mom, and Stella feels bad about having been so clumsy, and everything's fine, and mother and daughter patch things up. Laurel's away at school, and one day Stella is summoned by Stephen's divorce attorney, and Stella comes dressed, to the nines, or what she thinks is the nines. The outfit is actually really like, oh my God. Okay, but she comes dressed like this. And the attorney, starts to, say to Mrs. Dallas, basically he gets to the point, which is, Mr. Dallas is looking for a divorce. Enough time has gone on where it's shown that the two of you really aren't going to be continuing with your marriage. And Mr. Dallas would like to divorce with you so that he would be free to marry. And you don't have any worries. Mr. Dallas would continue with his allowance. He might even up it a little bit just to help you out with things. And all you have to do is grant him this divorce. And Stella, who wasn't born yesterday, leans over the desk and he's like, he'd like a divorce, would he? Well, I don't see what's wrong with the arrangement that we have. After all, I've got a marriage license and he has to honor it. And he's like, well, Mrs. Dallas, you could, oh, so maybe he wants to be free to marry Miss Long Island out there? Who's cheating on who here, sir? And he's like, well, you have the child to think of, and I'm not giving up Laurel to him. I can give Laurel everything that he could possibly give her. I could give her fine dancing and fine dresses and fine schools. No, I will not divorce Mr. Dallas at all. And I'm not looking for more money. He can keep sending the amount he's been sending, but he's not going to be divorced from me, and he's not going to have Laurel. And she throws, her fake fur over one shoulder, and she departs in a harumph. And this to me is really the full moon in Capricorn. Okay. We have the moon as far away from the sun as it can possibly be. The moon is in its full glory, in its full light in the nighttime sky. Stella has the power here. Stephen needs her to divorce if he's going to marry Helen and move Lolly into that household. And Stella isn't participating. She's not going to give any ground with it. So Stella is at her most powerful. The moon is full. It's squarely on Stella's side of the argument, on Stella's side of the arrangement. She's not going to be separated from her daughter. This has nothing to do with Stephen and him going on. It's when he brought up Lolly and custody that she refuses it because she is bound to Lolly, and Lolly, Laurel, is equally bound to her. As we know with full moons, the moon reaches its full light, but at the same time that it reaches its full light, it begins to lose its light. It's not going to be as glowing and as full as it was before. And this is what we start to see happen in the story. So in Stella's bid to give Laurel everything that she needs, in Stella's bid to openly compete with Stephen, Stella takes Laurel to a high-end resort. And when they get to the resort, this is in the book, not the movie, Laurel gets a summer cold and can't go out, and Stella administers to her. But of course, Laurel gives Stella her summer cold, and so Stella takes to bed, and she can't go out. And Stella's like, go out, go out. We came here. I want you to meet some great kids and things like that. And Laurel has always been one of those children that hasn't really fit in with other children. There was always something that was awkward about her, whether it was making up stories as to why her father never showed up or why her mother would move her from town to town. There's a quality in Laurel where she's had to grow up very fast. She's more sophisticated than girls would be at her age, and she keeps to herself. She's a big book reader. She loves museums and art, and so she's not putting on these refinements as anything artificial. She has a genuine love of old things, and she has a genuine love of her own company and books and literature. This is mirrored by her mother's love of the latest fashion magazine and comic books and gossip and society pages. Stella eats that stuff up, and Laurel couldn't care less. Anyway, Laurel is at a fancy resort, and she starts hanging out with the other kids that are her age, and they take to Laurel immediately. The girls adopt her as one of their own, and they don't really know anything about her background, and her father does business in New York City, and that sounds all sorts of fabulous and fine, and she's so refined and sophisticated, and the clothing that she wears is perfectly tailored. And if the girls think she's great, of course the boys think she's great. And this is summer. They're having summer romances and things like that. I think the kids are like 17 or 18 or something along those lines, 16 or 17. And they're riding bikes together, and they're going canoeing and having picnics and just having a great time of it. Laurel happens to catch the eye of a kid whose name is Richard Grosvenor III, and he falls for Laurel immediately. And Richard is very handsome and is very sporty looking and all those sorts of things that you would want in a summer romance boyfriend. But Laurel is a bit on the formal side. She's never really been alone with a boy before. It's fine if they're in a group, but Richard is smitten with her. I mean, Richard just thinks she's wonderful. I mean, she talks about books, she talks about literature, she talks about art exhibits and things like this. And Richard even speaks with a slight British accent, and so he's really, really drawn to Laurel. He wants to be with Laurel. And in fact, he pins her. He takes off they're not fraternity pins, but whatever acts as a fraternity pin for high school boys, he takes off the pin and he asks if he can pin it on her sweater, and she says yes. So Laurel is elated with all the attention. She's happy to have friends and happy to have this boy interested in her. She's very elated, but she also feels a bit awkward and shy about the whole thing and doesn't really know what to do. But what's really great is she has stories to tell her mother when she comes back to the room at night, and she tells her mother all these things about the kids that she's been hanging out with and this boy who's shown interest in her and everything. And Stella's like one of the girls. She's absolutely like, oh, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. And oh, Laurel, that's so exciting. Lolly, that's so exciting. This boy sounds wonderful. He sounds so well mannered and dashing and things like this. And I love these new friends of yours. And so Stella is really drinking all of this in. She's so happy for Lolly. This is what she wanted to give Lolly. She felt like she couldn't really give her this, but now she can give her this, and she's getting over this cold, but she's just all sorts of excited and happy for Lolly and about these kids, and she wants to meet them as soon as she can. And Lolly's like, oh, and you'll love Richard. He's really great. He's a gentleman as you would hope to meet. And Stella's like, I can't wait to meet him. So it's fun, this period of time. And mother and daughter are like, I don't know, sleepover besties or something, talking and speculating and fancying and things like that. And Laurel's so delighted that she can give her mother this to follow along with these stories and give advice and things like that. It's all kinds of fun. So finally, after a couple of days, Stella's feeling a bit better, and ready to go out and be seen and to meet Laurel's friends. And Laurel's off with her friends. I think at this point they're playing tennis or something like that. And Laurel, of course, is beating everyone. Laurel happens to be, who would have thunk it? Laurel happens to be this closet, tennis star or something, this unknown tennis star. And she even beats Richard, and he's, kind of like, hey, this is like really exciting. And they're bike riding and having all sorts of fun and things like this. And the whole gang decides to go to one of those milkshake shoppies or something like that. Soda parlors, I think they were called back in the day. And they've all lined up at the counter, and they're drinking their milkshakes or their sodas or something like that. And off in the corner are Richard and Laurel, and they're, next to one another. They're being all kinds of dreamy. They're being all kinds of romantic with one another. Well, Stella has decided that she's feeling much better. So she puts on all the makeup and she gets her hair up in a do, and she puts on this enormous hat, and she's got this veil, and she's got the gloves and the fake jewelry, the necklaces and the bracelets. The bracelets, when she does this with her hands, you can hear them. Maybe there's an extra tinkly thing on her shoes. And, she fashion forward Stella. Okay. She's the epitome of chic as far as she is concerned. And so she goes out looking for Laurel, and she can't find her right away. And there's a whole resort, and she asks around, and she walks through the terrace where the guests are lunching, and they're like, oh my God, look at that. And people are like, what? And they're like, and they look, and Stella's looking around for Laurel, and the guests of the hotel are just like, they're covering their faces. There's menus. They're laughing hysterically. They're pointing, and they're like, what is that creature doing here at this resort? I mean, she's so cheap looking. She's so tawdry looking. It's like, who goes out dressed like that? And Stella's completely oblivious because she's looking around for Laurel. And she walks down into the golf course, and she walks by the swimming pool, giving everyone ample opportunity to see her. And she goes through the tennis courts and things like this. And she sees the soda shop, and so she heads on over to there. And immediately the friends turn around and they're like, look at what's approaching. Look at what's approaching. We can't believe this. It's like, what is that? What do you call that? Look at what she's wearing. and they all start giggling and they're pointing. And Laurel, hears them, and she turns around, and she sees her mother entering the store, but her mother has been taken up with, I don't know, maybe there's like little bracelets or something like that, or perfume. I forget, something that's also being sold at the soda fountain, and she's more perusing the items in a counter, thinking that she's showing off to everyone in the room and not registering that she's the laughing stock of everyone in the room. And what happens here is that Laurel looks on in horror at her mother, and she turns around, and she is like, I have to get out of here. I mean, you can see the actress, like the mental wheels are spinning, and she turns to Richard and she's like, you know what? Um, oh my goodness, I can't believe it. My watch. I've lost my watch. And he's like, well, it should be around here somewhere. And she's like, can you help me find it? And they look around the stools or on the counter stools and things like that. And she's like, you know what? I think I lost the watch when we were canoeing. And could we canoe back to that little island and go look for it? He's like, anything for you, Laurel. And so they exit. And so she's not there when her mother, appears, and all the kids are just like snickering, and the snickering is getting louder and louder. There is a moment, maybe it happens when you're 12 or 13, maybe it happens when you're 16 or 17, but there's a moment when the door is shut on childhood. And that moment comes when you first experience embarrassment about your parent, where someone that you worshipped, or someone who meant so much to you, someone whom you were so close to, a dad you thought was the, best looking dad in the world, or a mom that you always thought of as being glamorous and beautiful, is suddenly shown to be embarrassing, suddenly shown to be less than. It's like a waning moonlight. It's a less than light. Someone who seemed so powerful and so parental and so reliable and there, someone you were so hungry for their affection and proud of, is suddenly seen through the gazes of other people. And their status, their appearance is found wanting. And this is the moment that Laurel experiences. Her mother had never been a joke to her. Her mother had never been something to be ashamed of. Her mother was her strongest ally. Did her mother make bad decisions and strange choices? Yes, but Laurel cleaned up after them, or she put them back together in a way that would work. So there is this extraordinary bond that Laurel shares with her mother, and now that's been altered irrevocably. Her mother is a laughing stock, and she's a laughing stock with her friends. It's not that it was about Richard. I mean, she could have cared less about Richard. If anything, Richard helped get her out of the soda parlor and onto a canoe and onto an island looking for a watch that Laurel could ultimately say, oh, can't find it. I guess it's gone. Let's head back. Like she provided, Richard helped her provide that much of a distraction that they weren't around. But when Laurel returns to her mom, who was like, hey, where were you? I was looking for you. And I asked for you all the place. I couldn't find you. Laurel is immediately packing up their things, and she says, we're leaving. We're leaving on the first train. And Stella's like, I don't want to leave on the first train. I've been sick in bed this whole time. I want to go out. I want to meet some society folks. I want to have some fun. And Laurel's like, no, mother, no, we're leaving. And she's like, what is it with you? I finally have some fun, and you're just like your father, and I never get to have any fun. And she's like, mother, I'll pack you. And so Laurel is busily packing her mother. And Stella's looking at her, and she's like, did you have boy trouble? I don't want to talk about it, mother. Did you and that kid that you're sweet on, did you have a fight? Mother, I don't want to discuss it. Oh, you had a fight, didn't you? Mother, where's your coat? And she packs, and she's like, oh, Laurel, People have fights all the time. Don't leave because you had a fight. You'll check him out tomorrow. The two of you will be on good terms again." And she's like, "There is no tomorrow, mother. We're leaving." And so Laurel ushers her mother out of the hotel. The hotel says to her, "There isn't a train right away. You can have to wait hours at the station for it to arrive." And Laurel's like, "That's fine. That's fine. We'll do that." And so when the train finally does arrive, the sun is set. It's early evening, and they fall asleep exhausted. But unbeknownst to Laurel, there are four, maybe five girls who have also boarded the train last minute. They've gotten their bags on, and the porter is checking them in. And Laurel recognizes their voices as they begin to talk. So one of the girls says to another girl, while they're waiting to be seated by the porter, "Do you want to hear what Ethel told me? Do you remember that funny-looking woman parading around the grounds the other day?" "No, I didn't see her." "You didn't see her? If you didn't see her, then she can't be described. You wouldn't believe it. I tell you, she was quite a number. Dresses up to here and paint an inch thick, and bells on her shoes that tinkled all the time." "Bells?" "And bracelets up to her elbow that clanked. You never saw such a sight. Anyway, do you know who she was?" "No." "Who?" "Laurel Dallas's mother." "Laurel Dallas? But I can't believe it. You mean that pretty little girl that Dick Grosvenor's been rushing?" "Yes." "But are you sure? She seems so lovely and sweet." "I know. Isn't it weird to have such a common-looking thing for your mother?" "Poor thing." "Poor thing nothing. She's wearing Dick Grosvenor's fraternity pin." "Well, she won't be wearing it for very long. Not when Mrs. Grosvenor finds out." And at that point, the porter reappears. The girls' bags are checked in, and he's ready to lead them to their car. Laurel has heard every word of this, but she doesn't know if her mother has heard every word of this. And if you've watched the movie, you know full well that Stella has heard every word of this. One of the most beautiful moments in the film is Barbara Stanwyck as Stella Dallas, as she's listening to these girls and this exchange, and the realization slowly sinking in as she realizes that she has become a liability instead of an asset to her daughter. But Laurel doesn't know this, and so she puts out feelers. She whispers down to her mother, "Mother, Mommy, are you awake?" And Stella replies, "Huh?" And Laurel, "Have you been awake?" And Stella, "Me? Oh, no, no. No, I've been sleeping like a log." And Laura's like, "Oh, Mommy, it's so lonely up here. I want to come down and cuddle with you." And Stella's like, "Sure, honey. Sure, darling. You can come on down." And so Laurel comes down and she cuddles next to her mother, Barbara Stanwyck. And it's this extraordinary moment where Stella Dallas is feeling ashamed, but Laurel is feeling the shame for having ditched her mom and secreted her mom onto this train. She feels like she's betrayed her mom and she wants to be close to her mom. And that beautiful moment where Barbara Stanwyck, Stella Dallas, is holding Laurel to her chest, and you see the light of the train, and her just sort of studying the wall, trying to figure out what's going to come next. It's just this beautiful moment in the film, and it's one of my all-time favorites. So Stella decides to seek Mrs. Morrison out. A couple of days later, she takes a train out to the Long Island estate that belongs to Mrs. Morrison, and she appears unannounced. The butler goes and retrieves Mrs. Morrison, and Stella introduces herself as Stella Dallas, Mrs. Stephen Dallas, and Mrs. Morrison invites her into the living room to sit down to have their conversation in private. And so Stella says, "I know you must think it's funny, me coming here like this. I'm not going to beat around the bush. But what I want to know is if Stephen was free, if I got a divorce like his lawyer wants, would you two get married?" And Mrs. Morrison responds, "Yes, we would. I'm sorry if it's unpleasant, but I'd rather you knew the truth. And Stella says, yeah, well, what I wanted to know is if you and Stephen did get married, uh, what about Laurel? Would you take her too? And Mrs. Morrison responds, oh no, Mrs. Dallas, I'm a mother too. Did you think that I could ever deprive another mother of her only little girl? And Stella says, yeah, but if the mother didn't want her, I mean, if she couldn't very well have her, if it was inconvenient. Mrs. Morrison says, inconvenient? And Stella, yeah. You see, Lolly's growing up now, and she's quite a responsibility. Mrs. Morrison responds, I don't understand. And Stella says, well, you see, it's this way. From now on, there are lots of things Lolly ought to begin having. Oh, I don't mean money. I mean dances and parties and, good times. And really, well, I've never really been good at that sort of a thing, and I feel like I've done all I can for her. And I thought that, well, you being so crazy about her father and she taking after him so much, and your name being Mrs. Dallas, you see, what everybody would naturally think that she was your little girl. And when she went places, you see, you're the kind of mother that a girl could be proud of. And here Mrs. Morrison murmurs, why, I didn't know anyone could be so unselfish. And Stella continues, and I'll say one thing, Mrs. Morrison. You'll never be ashamed of Lolly either. Everybody's just crazy about her. She makes a wonderful impression. She's refined and elegant and, oh, well, you already knew that. Anyway, she's crazy about you already. And, oh, she don't talk as much as she used to, but that's because she thinks I'm jealous or something. And I guess I was a little bit, but I'm not anymore. And you'll see that in a little while she'll forget all about me, and it won't be any time before she loves you just like you were her real mother. And oh, Mrs. Morrison, she's so wonderful. You don't know. And Mrs. Morrison responds, I do know. And I know that it hasn't only come from her father. And Stella says, I have to go now. Lolly doesn't know I'm coming. I don't want her to yet. She's all funny underneath about things like that, but I thought it out. It would be better to just let her come for a visit like she always does. And by that time, it will all be over. The divorce, that is. And then you can break it to her. It will be easier that way. And so Stella departs. Stella and Stephen do divorce. And Lolly is happy for her father. And she comes to visit him and Mrs. Morrison at the Long Island estate. And Laurel jokes it's an awkward moment. She says, I don't know what to call you. I mean, I can't really call you Mrs. Morrison anymore. And now you're Mrs. Dallas. I mean, and Helen says, you can call me Helen. And Laurel, your father and I have been talking, and we want you to know that this is your home, that you can come here whenever you want. And Laurel's like, well, that's wonderful. I love being here. That's a wonderful thing. And that's when Stephen, Mr. Dallas, says, well, why don't you come and live here all the time? We're married now. You enjoy your brothers, and we can all be a happy family. And Laurel recoils at that idea. She's like, well, what about my mother? What would happen with my mother? And Stephen is like, oh, your mother will be fine. I'm sending her an allowance. You can come and be with us. And she's like, no, this is impossible. And Mrs. Morrison tries to intervene. She tries to do a salvage job after Stephen's clumsy efforts and says, well, Laurel, this was your mother's idea. And she's like, no, I have to go. Father, drive me to the train station. I have to go see my mother, my poor mother. I have to see her. And so Laurel gets the first train back to her mother. They take a lot of trains nowadays. Okay, so Laurel gets the first train back to her mother. In the meantime, while Laurel is commuting, Helen has telegrammed Stella and told her about what had happened and that Laurel is coming back. And so Stella has had time to sort of brace herself for this. and she's, sort of gotten dressed up like she's going out to the evening in that fashion forward sense of Stella's, okay? And she's waiting for her daughter to show up, and her daughter does, and she pretends to be in the other room, putting on makeup and things like this. And she's like, "Lolly, is that you?" And she's like, "Mother, it's me, and I've come back here to live with you." And she's like, "To live with me?" And Laurel's like, "Yes." And Laurel, shares this plan about how she was supposed to go live with her father and Mrs. Morrison and become a family, and she couldn't possibly abandon her mother. And she's like, "Abandon me? You're not abandoning me, Lolly. There comes a time in a woman's life, Lolly, and right now you're pretty young, so you don't really sort of get this, but there comes a time in a woman's life where, she's she's kind of tired of raising the kids. She wants to live life on her own terms again, and that's where I am right now. So that's why I asked your father, if he could help out with that. If he could help out, she goes and she puts on a jazz record, a really loud jazz record, and she's like, "Yeah, I'm planning on going out dancing tonight and having some fun, Laurel." And she's like, "Mother, but I thought we could be together and maybe we could go see a movie." And it's like, "Do you know who's taking me out to a dance tonight? Edmund." Edmund? Yes, Edmund. I haven't seen him in a little while, and I called him on up, and he's taking me out to dancing, and we're gonna have some fun. We're gonna have some laughs, just like the old times, Laurel. Edmund. And I'll tell you something else, Laurel. He's asked me to marry him, and with your father being divorced and all, and I was thinking, why not? I always had a lot of laughs with Ed, and that would be a great thing. You're marrying Edmund. Yeah, and he's got this great job, you see, down in Buenos Aires. We're going to make a new start down in Argentina. He's got a wonderful job. It's in trades or exports or something like that. And I've been wanting to tell you about this myself, Laurel, and didn't really know how to break it to you, but now's a great time. And mother, how could you? And so Laurel departs in tears, and Stella, having done what she has done, just looks out after her and says, "Lolly, Lolly." And so Laurel goes running back to her father and Helen and the Long Island estate. And some time passes, and Laurel and Richard Grosvenor have reunited. Who knew that Cornelius Con, the oldest of the boys, happened to be besties with Richard Grosvenor III in college? So Cornelius reintroduces Richard and Laurel to one another, and they pretty much pick up where they left off. And it's a little Cinderella-y here because Richard had no idea where Laurel had disappeared to. She just left suddenly. And he had asked all their friends, but these weren't Laurel's friends. They were summer resort friends. So no one really knew who Laurel was. And Richard was sort of left to pine after her. And wonderful twist of fate that Cornelius, who's now Laurel's older brother, happened to reintroduce them. And so they pick up exactly from where they left off. Now, this next part's in the book. It's not in the movie, but it's a wonderful little bit. What happens is they start going out and dating. Helen, Mrs. Dallas, the new Mrs. Dallas, makes a point of putting this in the society pages that Laurel and Richard Grosvenor III are going out with one another. And so wherever they show up at spots and things like this shows up in the society pages. And Stephen gets a little bit like, why is their every move showing up in the society pages? What's the big deal? And Mrs. Dallas says, "Well, Stephen, this is a wonderful deal. We should be celebrating this. This is, how many times do we have our only daughter go out and enjoy society?" And Stephen's like, "Right, but it's still a little, I don't know, public, And so they move back to the Fifth Avenue house, and, they're splitting their time between the Long Island house and the Fifth Avenue house. And when they're back at the Fifth Avenue house, the new Mrs. Dallas has a strange habit of asking for the curtains to be opened whenever Laurel is by herself in a room, which is a little odd. And the servants are like, "Why are we doing this as this very sort of private thing?" So, but Helen is like, "Open up the curtains." And so when Laurel's practicing the piano, the curtains are open on the back of the house, which is an alley. It's Fifth Avenue, New York, or when she's reading, the curtains are opened, kind of in an inconspicuous but a conspicuous way to the servants. And the reason for this is that on one of these evenings when coming home, Helen had spotted someone in the shadows watching, who quickly departed, left through one of the alleys in New York City. And on another evening, she saw the person again, and she recognized that it was Stella. And so what she's been doing, that she's been making these social announcements, engagements, so Stella could follow along with Lolly's life, so that she could see what Lolly's doing. What we have to remember here is that Stella went all in when she said goodbye to Lolly for the last time. She has told Lolly that she's moved to Argentina. She's left no forwarding address. She actually has moved, and not even Stephen's checks can get to her. They haven't been collected in months. And what has happened is that Stella has followed them to New York, where she began tentatively watching. But once Helen caught on to it, she began publishing these things so that Stella could collect the clippings. In fact, in one moment in the book, Helen says, "Oh, that ought to be a really great announcement. She'll like that one." And she says it accidentally out loud. And Stephen's like, "Who, what?" And she's like, "Nothing, dear, nothing." But she's staging all of this for Stella to see. Now, Helen is trying to find out where Stella is, but she can never find out. So you really have this kind of like, remember that the moon is named after Diana, the Greek goddess of the moon, and also the Greek goddess of the hunt. And so Stella is very good at covering her own traces and of being able to follow the action, but never once giving herself away. So what happens is that she had left no forwarding address. There's no bills or there are no checks coming to her anymore. And Stella's pretty much fallen on hard times. And she's committed to Laurel never knowing that she's not in Argentina, because she knows full well that if Laurel knew, she would leave everything and she would come back to her. But at the same time, she can't say goodbye to Laurel. And so Helen Dallas knows this. And so that's why she leaves the curtains open so that Stella can go and look at her at night. And bear in mind, we start to see that Laurel's now living in a solar world. Okay, she's the lights are on at night and she's reading or practicing piano, and the window, if she looks out of it, is dark. But Stella, who's living in a lunar world, can look at Laurel. She can see Laurel, and she can feel proud of the young woman that her daughter has become. So the ruse may have cost Stella financially, but it did not rob Stella of the joy of seeing her daughter married. And this is the final scene in the film. There is a wedding ceremony that's taking place in the living room of the mansion on Fifth Avenue, and it's taking place at night and in the rain. And again, it's not really how you would have a wedding take place. You want a wedding taking place on a June afternoon or something like that. Wedding should be taking place on Long Island, not on a rainy night in Manhattan. But this is the way that Helen wanted it. And Laurel has resigned herself that her mother's not coming to the wedding. She's postponed the wedding, it's in the book, in hopes that her mother would respond. And she's given up hope that her mother will respond. And so she's getting married. And so she and Richard are getting married, surrounded by loved ones and friends in this living room that looks out on the street on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. And so a crowd gathered, and they're looking in the window, and they want to see the groom kiss the bride, the big moment. And there's a policeman in the rain, and he's like, break it up, because they're really crowding around this place in on Fifth Avenue and it's raining and it's making people like get off the sidewalk and walk in the street. And, it's a problem here. Among the people here is Stella. And this is the first time since the beginning of the film that we've seen her without makeup. Okay. We've seen her without the extra frills and ruffles and bells and things like that. She's wearing a cap in the rain and a coat, and she's holding a handkerchief, and it's so beautiful the way that Barbara Stanwyck plays it. She's looking up into this living room, which is lit, you know, for everyone to see. And again, what you see is this solar world. The living room is bathed in light. It's like a movie screen, and it's almost like Stella's looking up at a movie screen, but she's also looking up at this orb of light, this window of light where this wedding is taking place. But no one's paying any attention to the people outside the window. They're not looking outside the window. And if they were to look outside the window, they wouldn't be able to see anyone. And this is this beautiful sun-moon exchange that takes place because Laurel can't see her mother. She's looking at her groom and here's the light, but her mother can see her. And Stella looks up to see her mother, and the policeman's like, "Okay, lady, everyone else has moved. You've got to move on too." And she's like, "No, no, officer, please, please. I just want to see the groom kiss the bride." And he's like, "Well, all right." And he moves on, and she just looks there, and she's got this handkerchief that she's, pressing to her lips, and they kiss, and she takes it in, and there's this extraordinary moment where Barbara Stanwyck is looking, and the officer's like, "Listen, you have to move." And she's like, okay, I can leave now, and Barbara Stanwyck turns around, and instead of heartbreak, what you see is this expression of triumph on her face, and and the handkerchief is in her mouth where she's been holding it, and she pulls it out, and she looks forward, and she marches on down that New York street, and that's the end of the film. Stella Dallas is a film that's often described as a mother's sacrifice, but it's not. It's a mother's fulfillment. When you think about how the moon begins in darkness, how Stella wants to talk the way that Stephen talks and act the way that Stephen acts so she can be a part of that society, how the moon begins to gain more in its light, and Stella begins to realize she's her own person and she doesn't like being policed by her husband and she's really resenting it. And that her true love of this marriage is her daughter. And that's who is so important to her. And then when we have the first quarter moon in Libra, in a Venus-ruled sign, where she's beginning to understand that there is a difference between home life and social life, where both mother and daughter are beginning to understand that what they have bonded at home isn't seen as favorable or good by the outside world, and instead that brings the two of them closer together. We move to the full moon, where Stella really, in her strength, is like, "I will not divorce. I can give my daughter Laurel everything that Stephen can, and I will." And then the growing realization that she can't compete with Stephen, that she embarrasses her daughter, that she's seen as something shameful with her daughter, that people laugh at her when they see her with her daughter. And then this movement, this campaign to move her daughter into Stephen's world, but not as Stephen's child, but as Stella Dallas's child. More importantly, as Laurel, as Lolly, that Lolly's not going to be eclipsed by this world that she's moving into, that Lolly can thrive in this world, that Lolly's better suited for that world than Stella ever was. and that she finds an ally in another mother. I mean, that's what's so beautiful about this lunar energy, this Cancerian energy. She finds an ally in the other mother, someone who will introduce Laurel into that world, who will midwife Laurel into this world. And it's not just a world of class and privilege and refinement, but it's a world that Stella knows that Laurel belongs in, that Laurel will dominate, that Laurel will thrive in. We talk about planting seeds in a new moon, and this seed, this child, this Laurel, has grown and she's bloomed into her own woman. And this is the great triumph of Stella Dallas. There's also another fascinating thing that's going on when you think of the sun and the moon. When the moon is out at night, in whatever phase it appears in, it shares the light. It shares the light with the other planets and the other stars in the sky. When the sun is out during day, it dominates the sky. It becomes the only light. Sure, we might see the moon in the early part of the morning after sunrise. You can still see it sometimes in the sky, or we might even see the moon in late afternoon right before sunset. But when the sun is out, it's pretty much the only light that you see in the sky. In Egyptian mythology, when the sun sets, it's said to enter into the underworld. And here it struggles. I mean, Egyptian art shows that the barge that the sun sails is being defended by soldiers who are guarding it from evil demons. And so the sun, goes into the underworld and it struggles. It struggles to rise again. So much of what's associated to the sun in an astrological chart is the ascendancy, the rising into one's self, the realization of one's self apart from darkness, apart perhaps, and in many cases, from the moon. So the sun needs to dominate a situation. It needs to be the light. The moon is not like that. We see in her changing phases that she changes her light, that the moon grows, that she becomes. And so the solar identity is based on a separation of the sun from the night. This is something that I dare say, for centuries, is a problem that men have had. In Western culture, at least, there's been such an insistence on a man separating from his mother and going and finding himself by following the footsteps of his father, who might not be around or might be somewhere else. But, the whole part of becoming a man is to separate from the mother and to become one's own self. It's the sun separating itself from the night. It's the sun separating itself from the moon. But the moon goes through its cycle of light without separation. The moon reflects the sun's light in every one of her phases. Generations of lunar cycles aren't forgotten. Generations of lunar cycles build on one another like rings in a tree, that every year a tree lives, it expands just a little bit more. And these are recorded in the tree's trunk as tree lines. This is what the lunar cycles do. They don't forget each other when the moon has finished a cycle. It begins the cycle again. It adds another tree line, so to speak, in an ever expanding trunk. This is why the moon was associated to the growth of vegetation. So there is a continuance from mother to daughter that takes place. Now, people nowadays might be like, oh, there is no continuance, or mother-daughter relationships are fraught and things like that, and they are. But in the story of Stella Dallas, there is this continuance of mother to daughter. There's such a love, there's such a bond that exists between Stella and Lolly that it's unbreakable. The only way that it can be broken is for Stella to remove herself and to basically move Lolly out into the world. So the story of Stella Dallas isn't a story of Stella sacrificing her daughter to the world of the sun. It's a story of her planting a seed, starting the life of her daughter, making it strong enough to live. So in the realm of the moon, the daughter doesn't separate herself from the mother like a son needs to separate himself from the mother to go and, become a man. The daughter continues the mother. Now, that doesn't mean that every daughter has to have a child and continue the family line, but what's represented here in the story of the moon, in the story of an astrological chart, is a line of continuity, that one doesn't separate itself from the darkness, that like the moon, you emerge from the darkness, you grow in your light, you become whole and you become full, and then you begin to diminish. You begin to return to the darkness. And when you return to the darkness, that doesn't mean annihilation. It means that you continue another cycle where the light begins again. So things aren't wiped clean every time there's a new start. Things are built upon. And this is the great beauty of the moon, that the moon provides us with this memory. The moon provides us with this past. The moon provides us with this rich history. So the story of Stella Dallas isn't the sacrifice of a mother. The story of Stella Dallas is her planting a seed in the world of the sun and seeing her daughter flourish and grow. If you enjoyed what you saw, please press the like button. It helps more than you know. If you could subscribe, that would be wonderful. I've had such a wonderful time visiting with you this week, and I can't wait to get together next time on Christopher Renstrom Astrology.